10,000 men, 3 meals a day. In the middle of the Wyoming desert, 200 miles from the nearest town. Every morning before dawn, railroad cooks fired up cast iron stoves mounted on rail cars and started a stew that would feed an army. Beef, usually. Beans, always. Coffee so strong it could dissolve a spoon. The stew cost the railroad about 3 cents a serving, and it was the only thing standing between 10,000 workers and starvation. This is the story of how America fed the men who built the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about what feeding 10,000 men in 1867 actually meant. Because from where you're sitting right now, with a refrigerator humming in the next room and a grocery store 15 minutes away, the scale of this problem is almost impossible to comprehend. The Central Pacific Railroad was building east from Sacramento. The Union Pacific was building west from Omaha. And somewhere in the middle, in the Utah desert, they would meet. But between those two starting points lay 1,800 miles of nothing. Not nothing as in not much there. Nothing as in no towns, no farms, no supply depots, no roads, no telegraph lines, no civilization whatsoever. The railroad workers weren't building through settled country. They were building through wilderness. The Platte River Valley, the Wyoming Basin, the Great Salt Lake Desert, the Sierra Nevada. These weren't places where you could send someone to the general store. These were places where the nearest source of flour might be 300 miles behind you on a rail line you hadn't finished yet. And every single day, those 10,000 men needed to eat. Let's do the math together. 10,000 workers, 3 meals a day. That's 30,000 meals. Every single day. For 6 years. We're talking about 65 million meals served in the middle of nowhere. 65 million plates of food that had to be sourced, transported, stored, prepared, and served in conditions that would make a modern health inspector collapse on the spot. The Central Pacific alone employed over 12,000 workers at its peak. The Union Pacific had 8 to 10,000, and every single one of them burned 5 to 6,000 calories a day. They were laying track, blasting tunnels through granite, hauling ties up mountainsides, swinging 16-pound sledgehammers for 12 hours straight. These men weren't doing desk work. They were doing the hardest physical labor human beings have ever done in temperatures that range from 110 degrees in the Nevada desert to 40 below zero in the Wyoming winter. A man burning 6,000 calories a day who doesn't get fed is a man who dies. It's that simple. Starvation doesn't take weeks when you're working that hard. It takes days. A week without adequate food, and your workforce starts collapsing. 2 weeks, and you're burying men. The railroad companies understood this. Charles Crocker, the construction superintendent for the Central Pacific, once said that his railroad ran on 3 things: gunpowder, muscle, and groceries. And of the 3, groceries worried him the most. Because gunpowder you could stockpile, muscle you could hire. But groceries spoiled. Groceries ran out. Groceries required a supply chain that stretched back across the same wilderness you were trying to conquer. So how did they do it? How did the Central Pacific and Union Pacific feed armies of workers in places where there was nothing to eat? The answer starts with the railroad itself. You see, the railroad wasn't just the product. The railroad was also the supply line. As the track pushed forward, supply trains followed behind. Everything the workers needed, from rail and ties to food and medicine, came up that single track. The end of the line was called Railhead, and Railhead was a moving city. It advanced a few miles every day, and everything followed it. At Railhead, the railroad companies built temporary towns, tent cities, but organized tent cities with designated areas for sleeping, for supplies, for the blacksmith shop, for the telegraph office, and for the kitchens, always the kitchens. Because feeding the men wasn't something that happened on the side. It was central to the entire operation. The Union Pacific developed what they called boarding cars or kitchen cars. These were converted boxcars fitted with cast iron stoves, food storage, and serving areas. Each kitchen car could prepare food for about 500 men. The Central Pacific used a similar system, though they also relied heavily on fixed cookhouses at major construction camps. Now imagine one of these kitchen cars. You're standing inside a boxcar that's been gutted and rebuilt. Along one wall runs a cast iron stove, bolted to the floor so it doesn't shift when the car moves. The stove burns wood or coal, and it's hot enough to make the air shimmer. You can feel the heat from 6 feet away. Above the stove hang iron pots, each one big enough to hold 50 gallons of stew. The walls are lined with shelves holding tin plates, tin cups, utensils. Barrels of flour are stacked in the corner. Sacks of dried beans hang from hooks. Slabs of salt pork dangle from the ceiling, leaving a permanent smell of smoke and fat in the air. The cook, and there was always one head cook per car, worked 16-hour days. He started before dawn, building the fire, starting the coffee. The coffee was critical. You need to understand that railroad workers didn't drink coffee because they liked it. They drank coffee because it was safe. Water out there was dangerous. Alkaline springs, contaminated streams. Cholera was a constant threat. But coffee, boiled coffee, killed whatever was in the water. A man who drank coffee lived. A man who drank untreated water died. So the coffee pot was never empty, not once. The fire burned all day and all night, and the coffee stayed hot. Breakfast came before first light. The men had to eat before they walked to the work site, which could be miles from railhead. Breakfast was simple: salt pork fried in its own fat, hardtack, those tooth-breaking biscuits that would last for years without spoiling, coffee. Sometimes beans left over from the night before. The goal wasn't cuisine, the goal was calories. Get as much energy into those men as possible before they picked up their tools. Lunch, when there was lunch, came to the work site. Kitchen crews loaded food into wagons and hauled it out to wherever the men were working. But often, there wasn't a real lunch. Workers carried hardtack in their pockets, gnawed on it when they could. Or they went without, waiting for dinner. Dinner was the real meal. Dinner was when the stew came out. And the stew was everything. Beef stew, usually. Whatever meat was available cut into chunks, thrown into those 50-gallon iron pots with beans, onions if they had them, potatoes if they were lucky. The stew simmered all day. By evening, it was thick enough to stand a spoon in. The men lined up with their tin plates, and the cook ladled it out. Bread if there was bread, more hardtack if there wasn't. More coffee, always more coffee. The cost of all this? The railroad companies kept meticulous records, because of course they did. The Union Pacific calculated that feeding one worker cost approximately 45 to 50 cents per day. Breakfast, around 10 cents. Dinner, around 20 cents. Supplies, transport, and labor made up the rest. That 3-cent stew I mentioned, that was the ingredient cost alone. A pound of beef at the railhead cost about 8 cents. Beans were 2 cents a pound. A 50-gallon pot of stew served maybe 150 men. Do the math. But getting those ingredients to the railhead, that's where the real expense came in. Consider what it took to get a slab of beef to a construction camp in the Nevada desert. The cattle were raised in Texas or California. They were driven hundreds of miles to a railhead, slaughtered at a temporary butchering station. The meat was salted or dried because, again, no refrigeration. Then it was loaded onto supply trains and hauled to the end of the line. A pound of beef that cost 3 cents in Chicago cost 8 cents at the railhead. A sack of flour that cost $2 in Sacramento cost $6 in the Sierra Nevada. And that was when the supply line worked. When it didn't, when a bridge washed out, when a train derailed, when the track hadn't caught up to the workforce, when winter storms closed the passes, then the men went hungry. There are accounts of work crews going 3 and 4 days without a supply train. 3 days without fresh food. 3 days of hardtack and whatever game the hunters could shoot. Rabbit, antelope, sage grouse, whatever moved. The hunting crews were a whole operation unto themselves. The railroad companies employed professional hunters whose sole job was to supplement the food supply. These men rode out ahead of the construction crews, shooting buffalo on the plains, deer in the mountains, ducks along the rivers. A good hunter could bring in 500 pounds of fresh meat in a week. William Cody, who would later become famous as Buffalo Bill, got his start supplying meat to the Kansas Pacific Railroad. The same model applied to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Fresh game meant fresh protein, and fresh protein meant workers who could swing hammers. But hunting couldn't feed 10,000 men. Hunting was a supplement, not a solution. The real solution was logistics. Industrial-scale logistics applied to food for probably the first time in American history. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten American history like this every week. Now, let me tell you about the kitchen cars themselves, because these were engineering marvels in their own right. A standard Union Pacific kitchen car was about 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. That's 400 square feet. To cook, store food, and serve 500 men. The efficiency required was extraordinary. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. There was no wasted space, because wasted space meant less food, and less food meant dead workers. The stoves were massive, cast iron weighing several hundred pounds, bolted directly to the car's frame. They had multiple cooking surfaces, so the cooks could have stew simmering on one burner, coffee brewing on another, salt pork frying on a third. The chimney ran up through the roof of the car, drawing the smoke out. When in winter, that stove was the only heat source. The cooks slept in the kitchen car, and they slept near the stove because everywhere else was freezing. Water storage was critical. Each kitchen car carried barrels of water, filled at every opportunity. Creek crossings, springs, any water source that looked clean. The water barrels held about 50 gallons each, and a car might carry 10 or 15 barrels. 700 gallons of water sounds like a lot until you realize you're making coffee for 500 men 3 times a day. The water ran out fast, and when it ran out, everything stopped. The cooks themselves were a special breed. You didn't become a railroad cook because you loved cooking. You became a railroad cook because you were tough enough to handle the work and smart enough to manage the logistics. A head cook was responsible for feeding hundreds of men with whatever supplies he had. When the flour ran low, he made do. When the beef ran out, he improvised. A good cook was worth his weight in gold, and the railroad companies knew it. They paid cooks more than regular laborers, sometimes twice as much, because a demoralized workforce with bad food was a workforce that quit. And you couldn't afford quitters when you were racing to lay more track than your competitor. There was competition between the kitchens, too. At major construction camps where multiple kitchen cars operated, the men would talk about which car had the better cook, which car had the best stew, the freshest bread, the strongest coffee. It sounds trivial until you realize that these men had nothing else to look forward to. No entertainment, no families, no recreation. Food was the only pleasure they had. The cook who made good food was a hero. The cook who made bad food was despised. Let me tell you about a cook named Ah Toy. He ran one of the Chinese kitchen cars for the Central Pacific in 1867. The records describe him as efficient and clean, which in railroad documentation is high praise. Ah Toy managed a crew of 6 assistant cooks, and together they fed over 600 Chinese workers every day. His kitchen car was reportedly spotless, the food consistent, the portions fair. When Ah Toy's car broke an axle near Reno and had to be left behind for repairs, his crew reportedly refused to eat from another kitchen car until his was fixed. That's the kind of loyalty a good cook earned. And that brings us to one of the most important and least discussed aspects of this story. The fact that the Chinese workers and the Irish workers didn't eat together. They couldn't have eaten together even if they'd wanted to, because the food was completely different. The Central Pacific Railroad employed between 10 and 12,000 Chinese workers at its peak. These men made up 80% of the construction workforce in California and Nevada. They blasted the tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. They laid track across the desert. They built the most difficult sections of the entire railroad. And they did it while maintaining their own food culture, thousands of miles from home. The Chinese workers had their own kitchen cars, their own cooks, their own supply chains. They didn't eat beef stew and hardtack. They ate rice, dried fish, preserved vegetables, tea, dried mushrooms, dried oysters, dried abalone, cuttlefish, bamboo shoots. These ingredients were imported from San Francisco, where Chinese merchants maintained extensive trade networks with Asia. Shiploads of dried goods arrived at the San Francisco docks and were immediately loaded onto trains heading east to the construction camps. The logistics of the Chinese food supply were actually more complex than the American food supply, because these ingredients had to travel farther through more middlemen at greater expense. a pound of dried fish that cost 10 cents in Canton cost 40 cents by the time it reached a work camp in the Nevada desert. The Central Pacific initially balked at the expense. Why should they pay for imported Chinese food when American food was available? But Charles Crocker quickly learned the answer. The Chinese workers wouldn't eat American food, or rather, they would eat it under protest, and their productivity would collapse. The food they grew up with wasn't just preference, it was identity. It was the one piece of home they could maintain in a place that was utterly foreign. When the railroad tried to serve them beef stew, the workers got sick. Their systems weren't adapted to it. When the railroad provided rice and dried fish, the workers thrived. And there was another factor. The Chinese workers drank tea, boiled tea, which meant they weren't drinking contaminated water. The Irish workers drank coffee, which was also boiled. But the Chinese tea ritual was more rigorous. Tea at every meal. Tea during work breaks. Constantly boiling water, constantly sterilizing it. The result? The Chinese work crews had dramatically lower rates of dysentery and cholera than the Irish and American crews. Crocker noticed. He wrote in his memoirs that the Chinese workers lived better, worked harder, and died less than any other group. The typical Chinese worker's meal looked like this: a bowl of rice, steamed over a wood fire, a few pieces of dried fish, rehydrated and fried with vegetables, pickled cabbage or bamboo shoots on the side, tea to drink, always tea. The meal was lighter than the American stew and hardtack diet, but it was balanced. Protein from the fish, carbohydrates from the rice, vitamins from the vegetables. The American workers got their calories from fat and starch. The Chinese workers got their calories from a wider variety of sources. Modern nutritionists would call it a healthier diet. In 1867, nobody called it anything. They just noticed that the Chinese crews kept working when the American crews dropped. The separate kitchen system created separate communities within the larger camp. The Chinese workers lived together, ate together, and worked together in their own crews. They spoke Cantonese among themselves. They maintained their own traditions. On Chinese New Year, the camps held celebrations with special foods imported at enormous expense. Mooncakes, rice wine, preserved fruits. The railroad company grumbled about the cost, but paid it anyway. Because happy workers were productive workers, and the railroad was still racing to lay more track. The Irish workers, who made up the bulk of the Union Pacific workforce, ate differently. Their diet was heavier, meatier, more familiar to American tastes. Salt pork and beef were the staples. Potatoes when available, which wasn't often out in the desert. Bread or hardtack. Beans at every meal. It's because beans were cheap, filling, and didn't spoil. Coffee by the gallon. Whiskey when they could get it, which the railroad officially prohibited, but unofficially tolerated. The Irish crews had their own cooks too. Men who had worked in railroad construction camps across the country who knew how to turn minimal ingredients into meals that would stick to a man's ribs. The best Irish cooks could make salt pork taste like something worth eating. The worst turned everything into the same gray, salty mush. The men knew the difference, and they made their opinions known. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, about a cook on the Union Pacific named Patrick Shaughnessy. According to the account, Shaughnessy ran a kitchen car near Cheyenne in 1867 and was known for his bread. Real bread, not hardtack. He had somehow acquired a sourdough starter and kept it alive through the Wyoming winter, baking fresh loaves every day. The men from other kitchen cars would trade their whiskey rations for Shaughnessy's bread. When a supply train derailment cut off flour deliveries for 2 weeks, Shaughnessy reportedly kept his starter alive by feeding it potato water. When the flour finally arrived, he was the only cook on the line still baking bread. He became, briefly, the most popular man in Wyoming. Now, I want you to understand what mealtime meant to these men, because it wasn't just about food, it was about humanity. These workers labored 12 to 16 hours a day. They swung hammers until their hands bled. They breathed rock dust in the tunnels until their lungs ached. They worked in heat that blistered their skin and cold that froze their fingers. And at the end of the day, the only thing waiting for them was a tent, a hard bed, and dinner. Dinner was the one moment when they stopped being laborers and became human beings again. They sat down. They ate food that someone else had prepared. They talked with the men around them. For 30 minutes, maybe an hour, they weren't railroad workers. They were just men having a meal. The dinner line was democracy in action. Foremen ate next to laborers. Irish worked alongside Americans, next to Germans, next to whoever showed up looking for work. The Chinese crews ate separately, but within their own communities, the same principle applied. The cook didn't care how many spikes you'd driven that day. Everyone got the same stew, the same bread, the same coffee. The food made them equal. This mattered more than you might think. These were hard men working for hard bosses in conditions that were often brutal. The railroad companies pushed constantly for more track, more speed, more progress. 12-hour days became 14-hour days, became 16-hour days. Workers who complained were fired. Workers who organized were beaten. The only leverage the men had was their willingness to show up, and even that leverage was limited. There were always more men looking for work, but even the hardest company man understood that you couldn't push men past a certain point. And that point was defined often by the food. Workers who weren't fed would walk off. Workers who were fed badly would work badly. The quality of the food was a direct signal of how much the company valued the workers. And the workers understood this signal perfectly. There's a documented incident from 1868 where a Union Pacific supply train was delayed for 4 days by a bridge washout. The kitchen cars ran out of fresh meat. The cooks stretched what they had, but by day 3 they were serving hardtack and beans 3 meals a day. On day 4, 300 workers refused to leave their tents. They didn't strike. They didn't demand anything. They just didn't work. They couldn't work. They were too weak from inadequate food. The company response was immediate. Emergency supplies were hauled in by wagon, 100 miles overland. Fresh beef arrived by the end of day 5. The men went back to work, and the Union Pacific quietly increased its supply reserves at every major depot. They had learned that food wasn't a luxury. Food was infrastructure. If you're still watching, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. These stories deserve to be remembered. The ritual of mealtime had structure. There was an order to things. The men lined up by crew, usually. The cook ladled out portions, trying to keep them equal. The coffee was poured. Then the men found places to sit, on logs, on overturned crates, on the ground itself. They ate in relative silence for the first few minutes, too hungry to talk. Then conversation would start. Stories from back east, complaints about the foreman, rumors about what lay ahead on the line, news from the telegraph, when there was any. For the Chinese workers, mealtime included traditions that the American workers found strange. They used chopsticks, of course. They served food in specific order. Rice first, then fish, then vegetables. And tea was poured with ceremony, the youngest man at the table pouring for the oldest. These rituals had been observed in Canton for centuries. They were observed now in the Nevada desert exactly the same way because ritual was all these men had left of home. There were religious observances too. The Irish workers were mostly Catholic. On Fridays, when the church required abstaining from meat, the cooks adjusted. Fish when available, beans and bread when fish wasn't. Some workers ignored the rule entirely. The priests who occasionally visited the camps would hear confessions and say Mass, then leave the workers to their compromises with God. The Chinese workers observed their own religious calendar, offerings to ancestors, prayers before meals, small shrines set up in corner of the camp, which were incense burned and oranges were left as offerings. The railroad company tolerated all of it. They didn't understand it, but they tolerated it. Whatever kept the men working. As the railroad pushed toward completion in 1869, the feeding operation reached its maximum intensity. Both companies were racing to lay more track because they were paid by the mile. The Union Pacific was laying 3, 4, sometimes 5 miles of track per day. The Central Pacific matched them. This meant the workforce was moving constantly, the kitchen cars right behind, the supply train stretching back hundreds of miles. On April 28, 1869, the Central Pacific laid 10 miles of track in a single day. 10 miles. This wasn't just a construction record, this was a logistics miracle. Feeding the workforce that day required military precision. Kitchen cars were positioned at intervals along the route. Food was ready before the men even arrived. The workers would eat in shifts, one group resting and eating, while another group worked. There was no downtime. There was no pause. 10 miles of track, laid and spiked and ready for trains to run in 12 hours. The cooks who fed that workforce are anonymous. Their names don't appear in the records. We know the names of the executives, the engineers, the foremen. We know that Charles Crocker supervised. We know that James Strobridge drove the men. We know the names of the 8 Irish rail handlers who placed the final rails. But the cooks? The men who made sure those workers had the energy to lift thousands of pounds of iron? They're ghosts. This is the pattern of history. The men who do the work disappear. The men who take the credit remain. The Transcontinental Railroad was built by 10,000 anonymous workers and fed by anonymous cooks. And when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, not one of those workers was invited to the ceremony. They watched from a distance, if they watched at all. Then they ate their dinner, packed up the kitchen cars, and moved on to the next job. 3 cents a serving, 3 meals a day, 10,000 men, 65 million meals over 6 years. And when it was done, when the railroad connected a continent, when America celebrated its greatest engineering achievement, the food was forgotten. But the food is what made it possible. The stew in those iron pots, the rice in those Chinese kitchens, the coffee that boiled all day and all night. The bread, when there was bread, and the hardtack, when there wasn't. The dried fish from San Francisco, and the buffalo meat from the plains, and the beans that appeared at every single meal. The railroad companies kept meticulous records. They documented every spike driven, every tie laid, every mile completed. They documented the cost of steel, and the cost of labor, and the cost of explosives. They even documented the cost of food, down to the penny. But they didn't document what it meant. They didn't write down how it felt to sit in the dirt after a 16-hour day and eat hot stew from a tin plate. They didn't record the conversations around those fires, or the prayers said before meals, or the way the cook's ladle was the only thing standing between a worker and another hungry night. That's what history loses. Not the facts, but the feeling. We know what they ate, we know what it cost. What we don't know is what it meant. So let me tell you what I think it meant. I think those 3-cent meals were the only moments these men had that belonged to them. The railroad companies owned their labor. The foremen owned their time. The wilderness owned their bodies, wearing them down mile by mile. But the meal was theirs. For 30 minutes, maybe an hour, they weren't building someone else's dream. They were just eating dinner. I think the Chinese cooks who kept those kitchens running were preserving something more important than food. They were preserving identity. 10,000 miles from home, in a place where nobody spoke their language, where they were despised and exploited and worked until they dropped, they maintained who they were. They ate their food, on their way, with their traditions. The railroad got their labor, but it didn't get their souls. I think the Irish workers who ate that beef stew were doing the same thing. They came from a country where famine had killed 1 million people. They knew what hunger meant. They knew that a full belly was never guaranteed. So they ate. They ate everything they were given and asked for more. And they survived. I think the cooks, the anonymous cooks, were the most important people in those camps. More important than the engineers. More important than the foremen. Because without the cooks, nothing else mattered. No one can drive spikes on an empty stomach. No one can blast through granite without fuel. The cooks made the railroad possible, and nobody remembers their names, and I think that's wrong. So let me end by remembering them. Not by name, it's because the names are lost, but by what they did. They woke before dawn. They built fires in the darkness. They boiled coffee and fried salt pork and stirred pots of stew. They fed 10,000 men in the middle of nowhere, with no refrigeration, no fresh ingredients, no resources except what they could haul on a train. They kept those men alive through summer heat and winter blizzards, through supply shortages and budget cuts, through 6 years of the hardest labor America has ever seen. They did this every day, 3 meals a day, for 6 years. And when it was over, when the railroad was complete, They packed up their kitchen cars and moved on to the next job. No parades, no recognition, no golden spikes, just another camp to feed, another army of workers to keep alive. That's what built America. Not just the iron and the rails and the explosives, the food, the 3-cent stew that kept 10,000 workers on their feet, the rice and dried fish that sustained the Chinese crews, the coffee that never stopped brewing. The next time you see a train roll past, think about that. Think about the anonymous cooks who made it possible. Think about the meals that built a nation. Because the food is forgotten, and it shouldn't be.